Forget the Vikings you see in movies feasting on roast boar and drinking mead from golden horns. That was the 1%. For the other 99%, breakfast wasn't a feast, it was a chore. The champion of the Viking table was porridge or grouter. But this wasn't the creamy oatmeal you buy at the supermarket. It was a thick gray sludge made from barley or oats that had been ground between stones. Because the grinding technology was primitive, the meal was full of grit and sand. Every spoonful was a dental hazard, slowly grinding down their teeth until the nerves were exposed. This unglamorous slurry was cooked in a single iron pot over the central fire. Because the poor couldn't afford to stand around stirring at the porridge, often burned sticking to the bottom of the pot and infusing the whole meal with the bitter taste of charcoal. But they ate it anyway. It was calorie-dense, warm and cheap. To make it palatable, they might add a splash of sour whey, the liquid waste from cheese making, or a handful of bitter herbs. It wasn't about flavor, it was about fueling the body for 12 hours of back-breaking labor in the freezing cold. Meanwhile, in the chieftain's hall, the Jarl was eating a very different bowl of grouter. His was made with fine sifted flour cooked in fresh cream and topped with a lump of butter and imported honey. It was the same dish in name only. For the rich, porridge was comfort food. For the poor, it was the taste of survival. If porridge was the liquid cement of the Viking diet, flatbread was the brick. Viking bread wasn't fluffy or risen. Yeast was unpredictable, and wheat was a luxury crop that barely grew in the frozen north. So the poor used barley and rye to make a stiff, dense dough. They didn't have ovens, so they baked this bread directly on hot stones or even tossed it right into the ashes of the fire. The result was a hard, dry disc that looked and felt like a coaster. This ash bread had one major advantage: it was indestructible. Unlike soft bread that molds in days, this flatbread could last for months. A farmer could shove a piece in his tunic and eat it a week later. It was so hard it often had to be soaked in ale or stew just to be chewable. It was the ultimate travel food, powering the long ship voyages that changed the world. But eating it was a workout for the jaw, a daily reminder that nothing in the Viking Age came easy. Of course, the Jarls didn't suffer through this. They imported soft wheat flour from England and France, enjoying light, airy loaves baked in dedicated clay ovens. While the poor gnawed on rocks, the rich broke bread that was actually soft. But even the poor got to feast sometimes, usually on the day something died. Autumn was the season of the slaughter. As the grass died, families had to decide which animals to keep and which to kill, as they couldn't feed them all through winter. When the knife went across the throat of a pig or sheep, the first thing they collected wasn't the meat, it was the blood. In a calorie-starved world, blood is liquid gold. It's packed with iron, protein, and salt. To waste a drop was a sin. They would mix the warm blood with coarse flour sweet and maybe some wild thyme to hide the metallic taste. This gory paste was then stuffed back into the animal's own stomach or intestines and boiled. This was seltur, the Viking blood sausage. To a family raised on gray porridge, this was a delicacy. It was rich, savory, and exploded with flavor. It was the taste of life itself, harvested at the edge of winter. But the blood wasn't just for sausages. They made blood pancakes fried in lard and blood soup thickened with oats. Every part of the animal was a resource. The rich might sip imported wine, but the poor drank the life force of their livestock, knowing it was the only thing standing between them and anemia. The Viking philosophy of nose-to-tail eating wasn't a hipster trend. It was a necessity. After the blood was drained, they turned their attention to the head. Today, we throw heads away. The Vikings boiled them whole. This dish called svi is still eaten in Iceland. They would singe the hair off the sheep's face with a torch, giving the skin a smoky flavor, then split the skull and boil it until the meat fell off the bone. To a starving Viking, a sheep's face was a treasure map of textures. The tongue was a tender muscle. The cheek was rich meat. But the real prize, the eyes. The eyeball was a nugget of pure fat and fluid, a burst of calories in a lean winter. They would scoop the brain out of the skull cavity like pudding. It sounds grotesque, but it was efficient. Why throw away good protein just because it's looking at you? They also preserved the heads in barrels of sour whey, turning them into a gelatinous head cheese that could last all winter. The acid broke down the collagen, turning the face into a sliceable loaf of meat jelly. It was the ultimate survival food, ugly, smelly, but keeps you alive. If the head was a treat, the guts were the staple. The liver, kidneys, heart, and lungs, collectively known as offal, were the vitamin pills of the ancient world. A diet of grain and dried fish leaves you deficient in key nutrients. The liver provided vitamin A for eyesight. The heart gave coenzyme Q10 for energy. By eating the organs, the Vikings were unconsciously practicing preventative medicine. They would chop these organs up and throw them into the stew pot or stuff the lungs with suet and boil them. The stomach lining was cleaned and used as a casing for haggis-like dishes. Nothing was wasted. Even the intestines were washed and used to wrap sausages. It was a gruesome, smelly job usually done by the women, turning the most perishable parts of the animal into stable food. The wealthy jarl might enjoy a fried liver with onions, but for the poor offal wasn't a choice. It was the main course. It was the difference between a healthy winter and a sickly one. But how do you feed a baby this tough, chewy diet? Viking babies didn't have blenders. They didn't have Gerber jars. When it was time to move from breast milk to solid food, they relied on the most primitive food processor on earth, their mother's mouth. This is the practice of kiss feeding or permastication. A mother would take a mouthful of tough meat or hard bread, chew it into a soft pulp, and then transfer it directly into her baby's mouth. It sounds revolting to modern sensibilities, but it was an act of profound love and survival. It pre-digested the food, mixing it with the mother's saliva, which contains enzymes that break down starch. It also transferred antibodies, helping to build the infant's immune system. In a cold, dark longhouse, this intimate sharing of food was the only way to ensure a child got the protein they needed to grow. It wasn't just mothers, grandmothers, and older siblings did it too. It was a communal effort to keep the weakest member of the clan alive. It reinforced the bond of the family, literally sharing the same bite of food to ensure the survival of the next generation. In the corner of every poor longhouse sat a pot that was never washed. This was the perpetual stew or grease broth. It was a simmering cauldron of water into which every scrap of leftover food was thrown. Fish bones, vegetable peelings, gristle, and the hard rinds of cheese. It boiled 24/7, breaking down collagen and extracting every single calorie from the refuse. This broth was never empty. As bowls were ladled out, new water and scraps were added. It meant that the flavor of a rabbit caught 2 weeks ago might still be lingering in the soup you ate today. It was a liquid history of the family's meals. It wasn't pretty. It was usually a gray, fatty cloud, but it was hot, salty, and full of minerals. For the poor, this broth was the base of every meal. It turned dry bread into a warm dinner. It turned hard, dried fish into something edible. It was the caloric safety net that caught them when the hunting failed. The jarls had clear golden stalks made from fresh meat. The poor had a murky, eternal soup that tasted of everything and nothing. But what happens when the soup runs dry, when the flour is gone, the animals are dead, and the snow is still falling? That is when the Vikings turned to the food of the apocalypse, bark bread. In the deepest famines, they would go into the forest and strip the bark from pine or birch trees. They would scrape out the inner layer, the cambium, dry it by the fire, and grind it into a bitter, woody flour. They would mix this sawdust with the last scraps of grain to bake heavy, dark loaves. This bread had almost no nutritional value. It was filler. It tricked the stomach into feeling full, so you didn't go insane from hunger pains. It tasted like resin and wood, and it was notoriously hard to digest, causing severe stomach cramps. But it kept you alive for one more day. This was the food of the Fimbulvator, the great winter of legend. Eating bark was a signal that the world was ending. It was the ultimate testament to Viking resilience. When the land refused to give them food, they ate the trees. It is a stark reminder that for all their glory, the Vikings lived on the razor's edge of starvation. If you think your gluten-free diet is tough, try eating a pine tree. If you want to know how these same people survive nights of minus 30 degrees without heating, click this video right here. You won't believe what they slept on.